So you may or may not know, but I am the editor and associate publisher of the Alt Weekly, which is a paper that Over It is a partner of. So I have to thank Over It and only Over It. Having said that, you know two things about me that are not particularly well looked upon. I'm a suck-up, and I'm a journalist. And as we all know, journalism has been under attack increasingly in the last decade, to the point where now we have the President of the United States vilifying us. We have governors across the country trying to undermine journalism, limit access. Governor Andrew Cuomo, Bill de Blasio, Donald Trump, across party lines. Their tactic is to smear us as villains, fabricators, and yeah, suck-ups. So this is my story about how I became a journalist, because I think it's increasingly important for the press to make it clear that we are human beings, that what we do because of our humanity, because of our will and want to make the world a better place. And it might be cliche, but this is the story about how I decided that I would get into the lowest paying career I could possibly find, despite seeing on my professor's door a note that very distinctly noted how little I'd ever possibly be able to get paid. A career where, as I said, we're constantly attacked and made to feel as underminers. And it all starts with my father, so thanks, Dad. I don't mean that in the happy, fuzzy sort of sense. I'm sorry, this is actually sort of a downer. But a lot of the time I spend as a journalist these days is by the phone, waiting for the call from an important source. The idea is, this person will call me, give me a sense of what I should look for, maybe a tidbit of dirt. Perhaps they'll pull back the curtain in some way. It's very similar to how I spent my childhood. I was waiting by the phone, hoping that my father would call. There you go. I grew up mostly without my father. He was a British immigrant without a green card. My mother met him on the drive up from the Taconic from Manhattan. She was a successful journalist. She had a career in journalism, in PR. She worked for Minute Maid when Minute Maid was first the company. She reported on Andy Warhol. She went to parties with folks like Stephen Sondheim. She had quite a life, and it's extremely inspiring. And then she met my father. And it just so happened their cars had both broken down. They were at a shop on the Taconic, and they both were grieving. My mother had lost a best friend to cancer. My father, his first wife, had died suddenly of heart failure. So rather than cancel her vacation, my father offered to give her a lift. And then at the end of her vacation, there he was waiting to pick her up. Shortly thereafter, they bought a house in Germantown. They decided to renovate it, and they had me. The problem was that my dad had an interesting sense of what it meant to be an American. Coming from Britain, a very small country, as you know, and having grown up in a workhouse at one point, he felt that America was a playland. It was a place to escape. It was a wide open space for him to explore. And because of that, he drove tour bus. He drove big rigs. He would tell us stories about driving Pink Floyd across the country. He would tell me about the Manhattan Transfer and how he would illegally shepherd stolen goods across the Mexican and Canadian borders. So eventually my mother said to him, when I was 2 years old, "Phil, we need you here. You either stay here or you get lost and we deal with life without you because your son wants you here and he's confused." My dad got up and left. Now, our house was in the midst of an amazing renovation. There were missing floorboards, missing insulation. It was a New York winter was oncoming, the kind of winters we used to get, the kind of snow that we claim that we love and miss, but shut down the world. And my mother spent her days with me cuddled by a heater, trying to make sure neither of us froze. I think it's important to understand that my mother never said a negative thing about my father. She to this day says he would give anyone the shirt off of his back. What that translated to was, a neighbor needed a washer, our washer was theirs. If they needed a heater, the heater was theirs. We were still at home without a heater, without a washer, and that was his idea of being a good neighbor. It just wasn't that great of a father. So when we talk about journalists today, journalism, we know that people have lost a great amount of trust in us. Now, with the Trump presidency, there has been an increase of faith in reporting from newspapers, but it's still a very, it's nowhere near where it used to be, the trust the public has in journalism. As you can see, we're still nowhere near where we were in the 1980s and 1990s. And this is a picture of me as a child. So, growing up, my mother taught me the value of arts, entertainment, books, literature, psychology, and I was becoming a smart little kid. And then my dad reappeared in my life. He said, I want to bring you back to Missouri. I want to spend some quality time with you. And like a lot of people who consume news, I was hoping there was another truth out there. I was hoping that what I had learned about my father, the fact that he wasn't there, was simply not true, that perhaps he was really a good person, and perhaps, if I hoped hard enough and gave him a chance, he would become the person I wanted him to be. So I got up and left. I remember being in the airport with my mother, having a panic attack, thinking, I'm getting on an airplane to meet a man I've never met before. Up until this point, I spent time with him in an arcade where he'd give me change, buy me a cowboy hat, maybe have a breakfast with him at a greasy spoon truck stop cafe. I'd never spent much time with him. So finally, I arrived in Missouri, and despite all the things he had told me, he had a wife, he had moved on, and there was no chance he was coming home. I was there because he wanted to fix me. He was going to create a version of me that was better than what my mother had done, which is completely unlikely, given that his version of America was one where Walmart was perhaps the greatest pinnacle of creation, where literature and thought didn't really matter because America provided opportunity, limitless opportunity. And he set about telling me how I should get involved in look forward to going to community college to become a roadie. Which didn't sound particularly good to me, particularly sensible. But when your dad tells you, you should get into rock and roll, it's sort of tempting. And when he tells you, I know Roger Waters, I know Mick Jagger, I can hook you up with Pete Townshend, and you're a kid, you think, hey, maybe this is the way we should go. But then my dad said, you know what? I have another commitment. I need to go on a trucking run from Chicago to Texas to Seattle. So for 2 weeks, I was in the bunk of a 16-wheeler, traveling across the United States, listening to my father tell me that my mother had raised me improperly. I spent most of that time asleep because I couldn't really listen to it and reconcile what I was hearing. What matters to me as a journalist is truth. It's getting to the bottom of hypocrisy, of lies, of helping the public better understand the people who control their lives. As much as I'd like to tell you that I'm objective, it's simply not true. And I don't think any journalist can tell you that they're actually objective. I'm a journalist because I wanted answers about my father. I valued truth and exploration of issues over accepting what was presented to me. This is from Hunter S. Thompson, not a journalist whose work I think I respect, but who is honest. I think the biggest mistake we've seen some of the larger companies from the New York Times, the Times Union, the biggest mistake they've made in reaction to the fake news hysteria has been to say, we are real news. You can trust us more than anyone else. Forget those other guys, they're horrible, but we produce real news. It's fairly dishonest. It sort of throws everyone else under the bus and says that they're the people with the credentials to do this and only trust them. The truth is, humanity can't be erased. Opinion can't be erased. Objectivity can't be erased. This is what Norman Mailer said about journalism. If a person is not talented enough to be a novelist, not smart enough to be a lawyer, and his hands are too shaky to perform operations, he becomes a journalist. And I can tell you that's exactly where I was in college. It was a little surprising to some people that I made it to college. After that adventure across the country with my father, I returned home and started going to school less and less. Started going to shows in New York City rather than going and taking tests. I avoided school as much as possible until it actually became impossible for me to avoid because I was sent to a school for kids who were being very bad. But I made it through college, and while I was there, I thought I'd be a doctor because I wanted to help people. I wanted a way to give back to the community. I wanted to feel like I made a difference. I wanted to be important. But there was still that lingering feeling that I needed the truth, that the most important thing I could do is find out what was really going on, to hold power accountable, to deal with hypocrisy. So it was a mistake when I went to the college paper, wrote a story about how the internet wasn't working on campus. That one call I made to the tech company was a revelation. They begged me not to print, that their money and time had been wasted and that they were behind schedule, and that we wouldn't be getting internet service for another few months. It was news that students obviously weren't going to be very happy about. But right there, off the bat, I was holding power accountable. And I abandoned all plans to be a psychologist, to be a doctor. They were gone. I was addicted. Everything from there, I think, was a bit of luck. Unlike everyone else in journalism, I landed a job straight out of college. I've been employed as a journalist straight on since. I've never been forced to freelance. And I think it is luck. As you know, or may not know, PR professionals outnumber journalists 5-to-1 these days. PR professionals are told, give up on getting a story in print. There just aren't enough journalists to actually write it. And I know that it's true. Being a journalist, we get more press releases than we can possibly handle. We have so many stories we're already looking and working on in depth that the idea that we're going to print a story about a mall opening or a store opening, it's ridiculous. But with the amount of money that's put into journalism these days, the only value I see is doing in-depth reporting and boosting those who are doing good work in the community. So, well, sorry. Having been a successful journalist for a few years, suddenly my father again appeared out of nowhere. I wasn't expecting to hear from him ever again. It had been about 10 years. I was dating the woman of my dreams. I had a fiance. Things were going very well for me. And I said to myself, I should take advantage of this. I should go talk to my father. I should force myself to confront this person who has motivated me so deeply throughout my life with his lies. So my wife and I formulated a plan. I would go to Wisconsin, Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, a town of, I don't know, 100, and I would confront my father and document it. I would ask him about growing up with Mick Jagger, playing soccer with Dudley Moore. Some of these things are true. He has pictures of himself playing soccer with Dudley Moore. They're there. There's no disputing it. So we arrived in Chicago after a 16-hour train ride. The night before, I had a bit of an anxiety attack, and I was hospitalized, not because of the anxiety attack, but because I had stomach pains I just couldn't explain. My blood pressure was up, and the nurse said to me, "Are you worried about something?" I said, "Yeah, I think so." And I took out the IV in my arm and went home to pack. My wife and I spent those 16 hours on the train mostly in silence. We really weren't sure what to expect. I hadn't seen this man in 10 years. He's a British man who, for some reason, had embraced truck driving when he came to America. And there was so much expectations. This is a man who had promised weekly to come to base Little League games and not shown up. A man who, at one point, my mother had to hide me, forced my mother to hide me because he had ended some night on a tour bus drive, drunk and drugged out of his mind and threatening to kidnap me and bring me back to England. So there was obviously issues of trust going in. When we arrived, my father was there in his cowboy boots, just as he always had been, a cowboy hat. He still had his hair, but his face was like a melting bowl of pudding. He didn't have any teeth. He didn't have any dentures. And he looked like the saddest sack of humanity I'd ever seen. He was no longer threatening. And I thought to myself, there's no reason to attack this man. There's no reason to pick apart his stories. There's no truth to be found here. And I was right. For the next 2 weeks, my father talked about his morning calls with Mick Jagger, how he advised Pete Townshend how to write his first book, how the British government was set to unleash a conspiracy against Townshend, smearing him with child pedophilia allegations. He told us about how when he was in the workhouse, which we do believe is true, he would go out back and give Winston Churchill baths or run errands for him. While he was old enough for that to have happened, for some reason, I just didn't believe him. And it kept going on. He explained to my wife that he was disappointed in his daughter back in England because she had married a footballer. A professional footballer. It sounds good to me. As it turns out, the problem was he was an immigrant, and he wasn't white. My wife, my father hadn't noticed, was half African American. And yet he continued on this route. One night, we were walking the streets of Beaver Dam. My wife and I, she wasn't my wife at the time, but fiance. We were out walking because I couldn't stand being in the house. I couldn't listen to any more lies. And I said there were two things I was considering. I was either going to get in a taxi and go to the train station or to the airport, or I was going to smother my father to death with a pillow. And she told me, "You know, honey, I think there's a better route. I still think there's something to salvage from this." At that point, I was sure there wasn't a book. There wasn't a documentary. There wasn't anything of value. There wasn't a way for me to claim justice. There wasn't a way for me to expose this person. There was nothing left to expose. He was his lies. He was an old man with no teeth living in a 100-person town in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. The man who would have justified my entire existence was little more than a delusional truck driver. It made little sense. It was hard to reconcile. On the day that we left for home, my father insisted he drive. He had picked us up in a green, brand new Jaguar. It didn't make sense to me that he'd have such a car. And he told me he was proud of it because he was going to give it to my stepmother's grandson. That struck a chord because this man had only given me a cowboy hat and 25 cents as a kid. So he decided not to take the Jaguar. He took a brand new F-450. Our luggage was strapped in the back, and we drove from Beaver Dam, Wisconsin to Chicago. Eventually, one of the straps snapped and our luggage got loose. My father insisted that he take care of it himself. While he was doing this, I noticed he really couldn't use his arm. For some reason, it had escaped me much earlier. I was too busy listening to Pete Townshend stories. And he struggled. Eventually, the wire snapped and smashed the back window. I felt really sorry for him. I could tell he couldn't move properly. It turns out he was giving a tour of the back of the docks of Walmart, doing a safety check. When he opened one of the doors to a truck, a cargo pallet fell out and crushed him. He nearly died. His arm was paralyzed permanently. They told him that his lymphedema was so bad and his blood pressure so high that he'd never drive again, because sitting for an extended period of time would lead to a deadly blood clot. And he couldn't use a steering wheel. It all became clear to me just how sad this was at that moment. And my father said to me, David, I can't really afford to pay for this trip. I'm sorry, I told you if you came here, I'd pay for it. And also, I have to get my grandson a present. I sort of snapped at that point, very small, and said, well, Dad, this is October, next month is November, it's my birthday coming up too. I don't know if you remember this. He said to me, as he was fixing the windshield, I'll give you, I could use a drink. Why don't you go get a drink? He handed me $100 and said, keep the change. It's the least I could do for your birthday. I said, no, Dad, that's okay. I'm not thirsty. We got to the train station, and I'd hoped my dad would just get in the car and drive away. But he didn't. He stood there with nothing to say, the saddest person I'd ever seen on the planet. Sunken face, arm paralyzed, a red hue, because he had struggled so much to fix the windshield. And it was at that point that I couldn't take it anymore. I started bawling. My wife consoled me, and my father could see how much he had disappointed me. It was absolutely clear to him. He walked away and got in his car. I got in the train, looked out the window, and as I did in a kid, I still hoped to catch a glimpse of my father. But this time, I wanted to see a better version. I wanted to see the version that I thought I would meet. But it was too late. We got home. My wife and I were to be married the next year. And while I didn't come away with a book, and I didn't come away with a documentary, I thought maybe I could take pity on my father. So I invited him to our wedding. Our wedding passed. My father didn't show up. I got a letter from his wife saying he had fallen off the roof in October and was even worse off than he was before. She wasn't sure if he was going to live. My wedding was in September. It wasn't an excuse. It was a lie again. So we gave up. I haven't talked to my father since. There was no reconciliation. After a year with my wife, we had a child. And it got me to thinking, what is truth? What was it that I was looking for from my father? Is it something I can find in journalism? I think it's something I had already found by the time I went to meet my father. It was everything my mother had instilled in me. The value of truth, the value of learning, the value of holding power accountable. It was already there. And when I went to meet my father, that's when it all became perfectly clear that everything I needed was already there. I was looking for something that was already right in my lap. 2 years later, I had a child. We named her Asha, Sanskrit for truth. And my father has never seen her. I think journalism, for me, is extremely personal. And I think for a number of other journalists it is too. They'll tell you they don't vote to keep away from influencing a race that they knew too much about. They'll tell you they are completely unbiased when they write a story. But we're all motivated by human emotions. by everything that brought us to that point. And there's no escaping it. I believe the public knows this almost better than we do. And they've lost respect for us because we insist that we're unbiased and we're more than human, that we can escape all of this. And the truth is we can't, and we shouldn't. Journalists should be more upfront about the fact that they are human, and what they're doing is trying to serve the public. I hope in the coming years we have a better, a better approval rating, but I don't think it really matters one way or the other, because we have to do our jobs, and we'll continue to do them for the foreseeable future. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time.